3 months ago, I was balancing on that old wooden stool Eric kept saying he'd throw out since last summer, but never did, and I was trying to reach the top shelf in the garage where we stored the tangled holiday lights and the box with my mother's last Christmas cards. And as I stretched just a little too far to grab that stupid red tin with the broken lid, I felt the stool give under me and I started to fall, arms flailing, breath caught in my throat, and for a flash of a second I thought this is how I'd break something ridiculous like a rib or my pride, but then I didn't hit the ground. Instead, I landed against a body I recognized before I saw his face. Josh caught me around the waist with the kind of instinct you don't expect from someone who used to trip over his own shoelaces at family barbecues, and for a moment we didn't move at all, frozen in the middle of paint cans and garden tools and that weird oil smell, his chest against mine, his arm tight around my ribs, and his hand, warm, strong, steady, resting just a little lower on my hip than it should have. Definitely lower than you'd expect from someone who used to call you Lolo and ask for apple juice after school. I remember laughing because that's what you do when you feel your whole body go rigid and your heart skips in a way that's definitely not fear. And I said something like, well, I still bounce, apparently, trying to sound casual as if I hadn't just crashed into the kind of silence that hums between two people who suddenly know something they weren't supposed to know. But his eyes didn't match my tone. He didn't let go. And that look, long, steady, unreadable, stayed with me longer than the bruise on my knee. Today the doorbell rang just as I pulled the last towel from the dryer, and for some reason I already knew it was him before I even wiped my hands and stepped down the hallway, and sure enough, when I opened the door, there he was, standing in faded jeans, a white t-shirt stretched across his shoulders, and a battered, red toolbox in his hand like he was born for some old commercial that only aired during Sunday football games. Hey, he said like he always did, too relaxed for someone who hadn't warned me he was coming. Kelly said you needed help with the porch, loose railing or something? I stood there for a second too long, blinking at his face, trying to remember if I had actually asked that or just mumbled something at Easter when we were all crammed around the table, and I was trying to keep the conversation away from my quiet panic about how much Eric and I had stopped talking. Yeah, I finally said, tucking a piece of hair behind my ear. The railing's still loose, but I think I forgot to get the hammer, and Eric's working today, so it's kind of awkward. Josh smiled, stepping inside without waiting. Not for me. Honestly, I was just curious how you handle things when he's not around. He walked toward the back door without looking back, like this was normal. Like helping your older cousin's wife on a random weekday afternoon was just something guys did when their own relationships got too quiet to hold attention anymore. This year's porch hadn't gotten better with time or weather, and as I stood above him holding the flashlight while he crouched near the base of the stairs, I tried not to notice how close his shoulder was to my knee, or how steady his breathing sounded in the growing dusk. But when his arm reached across the beam and brushed my leg higher than it should have, my body jolted like I'd touched a live wire, and I held my breath, waiting for him to say something, to move, to laugh it off like the garage fall. But he didn't. Then I heard the bedroom door creak open, and Eric's voice floated out with that warm, sleepy heaviness it always had after night shifts. Josh? Oh, hey, man. Good timing. I'm on again tonight, but you two should be fine without me, right? Josh straightened, gave a nod, and didn't look in my direction at all. While I turned away quickly, my skin still buzzing where his hand had passed, cheeks burning with something I couldn't name. Later, I made tea, trying to act like the kitchen wasn't somehow smaller with just the two of us in it, like the overhead light wasn't catching in his hair or making his skin look tanned in a way it never had when he was 15, and I placed the mug in front of him, trying not to let my fingers graze his. You look different, he said after a long sip, his eyes not leaving mine. Not like when I was a kid, stronger, like you're not afraid to take up space now. I felt my breath catch because it didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like a confession, and I answered too quickly. You're not the same either. Back then, you were just a teenager. I'm 24 now, he said, still holding that damn mug like it mattered more than the pause between us. And I remember things, especially touch. My pulse stuttered, and I turned toward the stairs without another word, needing distance or noise or time. But I stopped halfway up because I heard the water running in the sink and his low whistling. Soft and off-key, the same tune he used to hum during road trips when Kelly and I argued over the radio, and for some reason that quiet, familiar sound hit me harder than anything else that night. I stood there in the half-darkness, hand on the railing, wondering how something so small could feel like the most intimate part of the evening. I didn't know why I went back downstairs, maybe just to say goodnight like a normal adult who understands boundaries, or maybe because I needed to prove to myself that everything was still under control, that the air wasn't charged with something I hadn't invited, that I could handle Josh being in my space without acting like it meant something. But the second I stepped off the stairs and turned into the kitchen. I stopped like I'd slammed into a wall made of heat and nerves because he was there on the floor, shirtless, in jeans, doing push-ups under our flickering ceiling light like he belonged in that moment, and he knew it. He didn't flinch, didn't startle, didn't scramble to cover himself like someone caught off guard. He just finished his last rep with perfect form, pushed himself up slowly like he had all the time in the world, wiped one hand across his chest as if testing his own pulse, and then looked straight at me with a calm that wasn't arrogant or surprised, just steady and knowing, like he had expected me to be there all along. His body had changed since I last saw him like this. Or maybe I had never really looked. Maybe I had refused to notice until now. The defined lines of his shoulders, the slope of his arms, the sharp cut of his collarbone visible in the overhead light. And still he didn't move toward me, didn't speak, didn't offer a towel or an apology, just stood there like a man aware of every inch of tension in the room but in no rush to break it. I thought about saying something, anything, even something stupid like, "Did you want tea?" Or, "The guest room's upstairs?" But the words caught somewhere deep in my chest because suddenly it felt like anything I said would mean more than it should. Like words would tip us off the edge of something we couldn't come back from. And so I stood there gripping the banister, breathing through my nose, trying not to look at his hands or the way the muscles in his stomach moved as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He kept watching me, not in that shallow, cocky way some men do, but like he was trying to read something he already half understood, like he could see every flicker behind my eyes, and still he stayed quiet, letting the moment stretch until it wrapped itself around my ribs and squeezed. In that silence, the kitchen clock ticked louder than usual, and I could hear the gentle drip of the faucet he hadn't quite turned off, and for some reason, those two sounds together, the mechanical rhythm and the broken leak, felt more intimate than the way his skin glistened under the light, or the way his jaw tensed slightly as he waited for me to react. I should have walked away, turned around and gone upstairs, said goodnight over my shoulder like this was just another visit, another Tuesday, another cousin helping out with a loose porch railing, but my feet didn't move and my body didn't listen because my mind was stuck back in the garage 3 months ago when he caught me as I fell and didn't let go. When we stayed frozen in that awkward hug a little too long and something unsaid settled in the air between us, heavier than dust and twice as dangerous. Now it was back, not the fall, but the feeling of being caught again, only this time I had walked right into it. He took a step toward the sink without breaking eye contact, grabbed a glass, filled it halfway with water, and drank it like he wasn't half naked in my kitchen. Like I wasn't standing there in leggings and a loose sweatshirt suddenly too aware of my bare ankles and the way my arms were crossed to cover more than warmth. Finally, he put the glass down slowly, not slamming it, just setting it like a full stop on a sentence he hadn't spoken, and said nothing. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was loaded, humming, alive in the corners of the room like static before a storm, and even as I turned to leave, I felt it trailing me up the stairs, sticking to my spine like a second skin. Back in my bedroom, I didn't turn the lights on right away. I sat at the edge of the bed with my hands gripping the edge of the mattress, staring at the hallway like he might follow, like maybe I wanted him to, like maybe some part of me was hoping he would say something, anything, to pull me back into that kitchen and finish what we didn't even start, but he didn't, and somehow that was worse than anything else he could have done. The morning started earlier than usual, and I was still in my robe when I heard the knock at the side door, that soft, deliberate rhythm that didn't belong to the mailman or any neighbor we still talked to, and by the time I made it to the kitchen, sunlight was already crawling across the tile floor in long stripes, and the house smelled like sleep and something unspoken. When I opened the door, I found Josh standing there with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, hair messy like he hadn't slept at all or had driven in circles before finally pulling up, and before I could ask why he was back again, he said, it like he rehearsed it in his head. My car won't start. Think I could stay the night just until I figure it out. I should have paused longer, should have asked questions, or at least made a comment about calling a mechanic, but instead I stepped back almost immediately, nodded before my brain had time to evaluate the words leaving his mouth, and watched him walk past me into the same hallway he grew up running through. Only now his shoulders filled the space differently, and the silence between us had a weight that didn't exist before last night. Eric had already left before sunrise for his back-to-back shifts, left nothing but a cold mug on the table and a text saying he'd be unreachable until late tomorrow, and somehow the house felt emptier than it had any right to feel, like it had been holding its breath and now finally exhaled because Josh was here and everything that shouldn't be happening was now simply present. I told myself I needed to change the towels in the bathroom, something useful to do, something that made me feel like a host instead of a woman reacting to heat in her chest. And when I pushed open the bathroom door without knocking, a habit from routine more than anything else, I stopped dead because steam was billowing out like smoke, and I heard his voice through it, soft and low, singing an old country song he used to play on his phone in the back seat during family road trips, back when he was awkward and too thin and always pretending not to look at my friends. The sound of that voice made my hands freeze around the towel, and just as I turned to leave, the shower stopped and he stepped out without warning, wearing only a towel low around his hips, water still dripping down his chest, and with a look that held no shame and no surprise. He met my eyes and said with a half smile, "Is this what you were hoping to walk in on?" The question was framed like a joke, but his tone was serious. So serious that it sank into the floorboards between us, and I couldn't think of a single line casual enough to deflect it. So I left without answering, hoping the sound of my retreat would end the moment more cleanly than my voice ever could. I went straight to the kitchen, heart rattling like loose glass in a drawer, and started slicing vegetables with more force than necessary, pretending lunch prep was urgent even, though I hadn't planned to cook anything more complicated than toast. When he entered the room behind me, fully dressed this time but close enough that I could feel the air shift between us, he didn't speak at first, just reached for a knife and a cutting board, like we'd done this together for years. He stood, behind me, not touching, not leaning in, but close enough that the warmth of his body wrapped around mine like an invisible second skin, and even though I knew it was wrong to let him stay in that space, I didn't move because it felt almost like gravity. He helped chop quietly, his rhythm matching mine, and I told myself I was imagining how deliberate his hands were when he reached across mine to grab the salt, the way his fingers lingered for just one extra beat before pulling away, and every time I blinked, it felt like I was trying to wake up from something that hadn't fully started but already refused to stop. That night, after dinner, after dishes, after the silence between us had stretched into something resembling familiarity, we sat across from each other at the coffee table playing cards, an old family game where the loser had to answer a personal question. And when I lost the fourth hand in a row, he leaned forward and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Have you ever wanted to kiss someone you weren't supposed to?" I laughed without thinking, too loudly, the kind of laugh you force out to distract from the truth sitting in your throat, and I looked away and said, "It's not real. It's just a game." But the words felt hollow because even as I spoke, he reached out and let his fingers brush against mine, slow, warm, and deliberate. He didn't say anything else, just held the silence like it was part of the game. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this was never about cards at all. I couldn't sleep after that, not even with the window cracked open and the fan humming in the corner and the sheets cool against my skin, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the way his fingers had hovered over mine during that last round, not pressing, not pulling, just touching like it meant something he wasn't ready to say out loud. I lay there for hours with my eyes open in the dark, trying not to overthink the air in the hallway or the silence coming from the guest room. But then I heard the soft creak of floorboards near the stairs, and the quiet shift of weight on the kitchen tiles, and something in me moved before I had time to question it. I got up without turning on the light, wrapped my robe tighter around me, and walked barefoot across the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the rug, and when I stepped into the kitchen doorway, I saw him standing at the counter with his back to me, shirtless again, glass of water in, his hand and moonlight spilling across his shoulders like a spotlight that didn't care what time it was or who was watching. He didn't turn around right away, just kept drinking slowly like he had all the time in the world, and I didn't say anything either, because words felt too sharp for that kind of moment, too loud for what was starting to form between us. When he finally looked over his shoulder and saw me, he didn't look surprised or apologetic. He just gave me this small half smile. Not playful, not teasing, just quiet and sure, and said, "Can't sleep either?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice, not trusting myself, and stepped a little further into the room, enough to see the way his chest rose and fell with every breath, enough to feel the distance closing inch by inch without either of us moving too fast. He set the glass down on the counter like he was anchoring himself, then turned toward me and leaned against the edge of the sink with both hands, his eyes never leaving mine, and that's when he said it, low, calm, careful, like he knew he shouldn't be saying it at all. "If you were mine," he whispered, and it wasn't a question or a pickup line or a dare, "I wouldn't leave for Kelly, not even for a day." The words hit me in the chest, not like an attack, but like a quiet unraveling, like someone had pulled loose a thread I'd been pretending wasn't there, and I stood frozen near the kitchen table, hands clenched at my sides, heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I didn't answer him, couldn't, because the truth was sitting too close behind my teeth, too raw and too real. And he didn't press, didn't move toward me with urgency or hunger, just stood there and waited. Then he took a slow step, forward, just one, and the shift in the room was instant, not dramatic, not loud, but definite, like something had been switched on between us without permission, and I could feel the tension stretch tighter across the room, a thread drawn, taut and shaking. He stopped just short of touching me, his hand hovering near mine, his breath soft against my cheek, and I thought for a second that I wasn't going to stop him, that I was going to let it happen, whatever it was, because nothing else in the world felt that real. But then somehow, from somewhere that still remembered who I was supposed to be, I whispered the only word I could get out: stop. It came out softer than I meant, barely a breath, but he heard it, and he stopped. He didn't ask why or push further or try to turn it into something light. He just held my gaze for one more long second, then stepped back without drama or complaint, turned away slowly, and left the kitchen without another word, disappearing down the hall like the whole moment had never happened at all. I stood there for a long time after that, not moving, not thinking, just listening to the distant creak of the guest room door closing and the strange silence that followed, a silence that didn't feel peaceful or calm. It felt heavy, like something sacred had been touched and then taken away before it could be ruined. By morning, the light was too bright, and everything in the house felt slightly off, like furniture that had been moved and put back in the wrong place. And as I reached for my phone to check the time, I saw the screen already lit. A memory, notification from 4 years ago, a group photo from Josh's senior trip, the one we took in the mountains when I chaperoned for Kelly's class. There he was in the back row, 15 years old, taller than most of the boys his age, but still unmistakably young, with awkward posture and a shy grin, standing a few feet behind me. And I was the one with the clipboard and the whistle, the responsible one, the adult, the older sister figure everyone trusted. Now, staring at that image, all I could think about was how much had changed, how everything had reversed, and how somehow, despite all of it, we had ended up here, in the same house, under the same roof, with the past hanging between us like a photo we couldn't delete. The heat that morning was thick enough to weigh down the air, wrapping itself around every surface like a second skin, and as I knelt in the garden pulling weeds that had taken over the flower bed closest to the fence, I could feel sweat sliding down the curve of my spine and soaking through the back of my tank top. But I kept going because doing something with my hands felt safer than sitting still with the memory of what almost happened the night before still clinging to the edges of my thoughts. I heard the screen door creak open behind me, and when I turned slightly, shielding my eyes from the sun with the back of my wrist, I saw Josh stepping barefoot onto the patio with a small bottle of sunscreen in his hand and that same unreadable look he'd worn since the second he walked into the kitchen the night before, like he hadn't just pulled the words out of my chest and left them hanging in the air between us. "You're gonna burn if you stay out here like that," he said, not unkindly, but with a tone that made it sound more personal than casual. And before I could answer, he walked over and crouched beside me, holding out the bottle like it was some kind of offering, and then added with a half smile, "Do you trust me?" I should have said no. Should have taken the bottle, stood up, walked back inside, anything to re-establish the invisible barrier we'd been pretending still existed. But instead, I turned slightly so my back faced him, exhaled slowly through my nose, and nodded once, not trusting my voice, not trusting my instincts, not trusting the way my skin already buzzed before he even touched me. His hands were warm and slow as they moved across my shoulders, spreading the lotion gently in long, careful strokes, and when his palm slid lower toward my waist and lingered just a second too long at the edge of my spine, I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink, because the silence between us was no longer an absence, but a presence, full and steady and pulsing with something I couldn't name but didn't want to end. He leaned in close then. Close, enough that I could feel his breath against my ear, and in a voice so low it barely existed outside my skin, he said, "Say stop, and I will." This time I mean it. I turned to face him without thinking, the motion slow and clumsy and filled with heat, and the moment our eyes met I knew we had both already decided, even if we hadn't said the words out loud, and then his face was close to mine. And when he leaned in, it wasn't a question or a demand, just a moment suspended in silence that felt like it had been waiting for both of us to stop pretending. My hands found his shoulders without resistance, without hesitation, gripping tighter than I meant to as the ground tilted beneath me, and the weeds and dirt and summer light all blurred together. And for one long moment I wasn't thinking about Kelly or Eric or the 100 reasons this was wrong. I was just holding on to him like he was something solid in a world that had started spinning too fast. We stumbled backward toward the side of the shed, breath tangled, skin burning, and when he moved toward me with a kind of certainty I couldn't match, and as the wind stirred the fabric of my dress, everything around us blurred into background, reminding me that this was still the outside world, still someone's backyard, still a life that didn't belong to us. And I broke away suddenly, breathless and shaken and staring at the grass like it might offer a way out of this. I Can't, I said, not even looking at him, voice shaking more than I wanted it to, and he didn't push, didn't argue, just said with quiet certainty, I know. But you want to. I didn't answer him because answering would have required facing what that meant, and instead I walked quickly toward the back of the house, wiping my hands on my skirt and avoiding the windows like someone afraid to be seen, by herself. And when I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I leaned against it with my eyes closed and tried to breathe like everything was still fine. He came in a few minutes later through the side entrance, smiling slightly like nothing had happened or like everything had happened exactly the way it was supposed to, and I hated how calm he looked, how sure, how steady, when I felt pale and shaken and raw like my own skin didn't quite fit anymore. We didn't speak for the rest of the afternoon. Not about the garden, not about lunch, not about anything that might require eye contact or acknowledgement, and later, when I reached into my purse to grab a receipt I needed to file, I found something I hadn't put there myself. A single piece of the caramel candy Josh always ate, the same one he had in his mouth that first night he took Kelly out for dinner, the one I teased him about because it made his voice sticky during conversation. I held the wrapper for a long time without knowing what to do with it, because it wasn't just candy. It was a memory folded into foil and left like a message I couldn't ignore. And as the sun started to fade behind the fence, my phone buzzed beside me on the couch, and I reached for it with a sinking feeling already spreading in my chest. It was Eric. He texted, not called, just a short line. They need me to cover Friday too. I won't be back until late Saturday. I read it twice before setting the phone down gently, then sat at the edge of the bed without moving, listening to the faint hum of the AC and the low creak of the floor in the next room where Josh was. Still too close, still too quiet, still not gone. I sat there on the edge of the bed with my fingers clenched around the hem of my dress, staring at the wall across from me like it might offer an answer to a question I hadn't allowed myself to say out loud. And the silence in the house had changed again, no longer charged with tension like before, but heavier somehow, like it knew what had happened out by the shed and was just waiting for the next crack to spread through the foundation. I thought about calling someone, maybe my sister or my coworker who still didn't know about the strain in my marriage. Anyone who could remind me who I used to be before I let Josh back into this house and into something deeper than just memory. But I didn't move, didn't reach for the phone, because deep down I already knew that no one could pull me back from something I had willingly leaned into. I changed out of the dress slowly, folding it too carefully for something I usually tossed over a chair, and pulled on soft cotton shorts and an oversized t-shirt that smelled faintly like clean laundry, like routine, like safety, then padded barefoot across the hallway to the bathroom without turning on the lights, hoping the dark might protect me from seeing myself too clearly in the mirror. I avoided my reflection anyway, washed my face with cold water that stung my skin in a way that felt like penance, and dried off quickly before walking back toward the bedroom, pausing at the top of the stairs because I heard the unmistakable creak of a floorboard followed by a faint thump. Josh, moving around below, probably in the kitchen again, probably doing nothing at all, but still managing to pull every thought in my head back to the curve of his voice and the weight of his hands. I didn't go down, not right away. Just stood there with my back against the hallway wall and my eyes closed, listening for something that would make me feel either braver or more afraid. But the house stayed quiet, and that quiet pushed me forward like a current, one foot in front of the other until I reached the bottom step. I crossed the darkened living room without turning on the lamp and stopped just outside the kitchen entrance, watching him from behind as he stood near the window, the glow from the streetlight outside cutting a soft outline around his body. Shirtless again, like he couldn't decide whether he belonged here as a guest or something else entirely. He didn't hear me at first, or maybe he did and chose not to react, but when I stepped onto the tile floor, his head turned slightly, and he said without looking, "You're not sleeping either." I nodded even though he couldn't see me, walked slowly to the counter and stood beside him, close but not touching, our shoulders almost aligned, and for a moment we just looked out the window together like two people passing time instead of sitting in the ruins of something we both pretended hadn't started. He leaned forward a little, resting both arms on the countertop and said, almost like he was reminding himself, "I told you I'd stop if you asked." And I knew by the way he said it that he had played that moment in his head just as many times as I had. I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't have words, but because the ones I had felt like glass in my throat, sharp and dangerous and likely to cut us both if I let them loose. So I just breathed and let the silence wrap around us until he turned slightly and looked at me, really looked at me. Not with expectation or pressure, but with that same quiet intensity that had been there from the beginning, and it made me feel both exposed and understood. "I shouldn't be here," he said quietly, not moving, not breaking the stillness between us, "but I'm not leaving until you tell me to." It wasn't a threat or a challenge, just a truth spoken into the space between choices, and something in me cracked, not from fear or guilt, but from the slow realization that I had already let him in the moment I didn't send him away. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but all that came out was a breath, and in that breath he took a step closer, slow and careful and impossibly tender, like he knew how thin the line was now, and when he reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, I felt my pulse trip over itself in a way that had nothing to do with lust and everything to do with being seen. I whispered again, softer this time, not even sure if it was for him or for me. "Stop." And he did. He let his hand fall gently back to his side, stepped back without turning away, and looked at me like someone who had already accepted the answer, but wanted me to be sure of it before he let it settle. Then he left the kitchen, barefoot and quiet, disappearing down the hallway like a ghost of something I had almost allowed to become real, and I stood there with my hand pressed to my chest and my eyes closed tight, not crying, not breathing, just listening to the echo of my own heartbeat and wondering how much longer I could keep saying no when everything inside me had already stopped trying to mean it. That night, I didn't go back to bed, didn't turn on the TV or scroll through my phone like I usually did to distract myself from decisions I wasn't ready to make. Instead, I sat at the table with the lights off, watching the shadows shift across the walls. And when the sun finally started to rise hours later and turned the sky a slow bruised pink, I felt more exhausted than I had in years, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying the weight of wanting someone I should have never let through the door. The morning felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, not because anything had happened yet, but because nothing had. The kind of silence that doesn't settle, just hovers, stretching across the walls and into the corners like it's waiting for something to break. I stood in the kitchen cradling my mug of coffee, fingers wrapped tight around the ceramic like it might ground me, and through the window above the sink I could see him, Josh, lying shirtless on a beach towel in the backyard, stretched out in the sun like he belonged there, like he hadn't fractured every part of my certainty in the last 48 hours. He had one arm thrown behind his head and his eyes closed like he wasn't thinking of anything at all, but the way his body angled slightly toward the house made it obvious he knew I was watching, and that knowing twisted something low in my stomach that had no business stirring again. I stayed at the window longer than I meant to, sipping slowly, letting the heat from the mug distract me from the heat on my skin, and when I finally pulled myself away to start cleaning up breakfast, I didn't even hear him come in until I felt him behind me. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the shift in the air, that subtle change that happens when someone stands where they shouldn't. I was rinsing a plate when I felt his hands at my waist, light at first, just enough to make me freeze, and he leaned in slightly as if reaching past me for the faucet, but the motion was too slow, too deliberate, and his fingers settled on my hips like he had done it 100 times before. I jumped, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the contact, from how quickly my body remembered everything I'd been trying to forget, and he didn't move away, just murmured against the back of my neck, "You're shaking." I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of being right, didn't want him to know how fast my pulse was racing or how I hadn't slept more than an hour the night before, because every sound in the house made me think he was standing outside my door, so I snapped back sharper than I meant, "You should be thinking about Kelly." His response came too quickly, too practiced to be spontaneous, and when he said, "I only think about you, every night," it landed in my chest like a stone, heavy and sure, and it took everything in me not to drop the dish in my hand just so I'd have something to blame the trembling on. I turned off the water with a little more force than necessary, wiped my hands on a towel without looking at him, and stepped away without saying another word. But the damage was already done, not from his touch but from the truth in what he said, and the way it wrapped around the part of me that didn't want to keep fighting. The rest of the day crawled by like it knew it was being watched, and by mid-afternoon we ended up on the couch, both pretending to watch something forgettable on TV, a background noise for everything neither of us had the nerve to say. We sat on opposite ends with a throw pillow between us, a weak little barrier that felt like a joke considering what had already happened, and I kept my gaze fixed on the screen while stealing glances at the way his fingers drummed on his knee, and how he shifted every time our eyes came too close to meeting. At some point, the pillow between us slipped, fell quietly to the floor, and neither of us reached for it. We just sat there in the new space, no longer divided by anything but hesitation. And when he turned toward me, there was no playfulness in his expression, just a quiet sort of inevitability that made it hard to breathe. He leaned in slowly, not demanding or rushed, just certain, and when his hand rose to touch my chin, his thumb brushing under it with the softest pressure, he whispered, "We're going to end up here again no matter how much we pretend otherwise. You feel it too." I could have denied it. Could have said something cold or sarcastic or smart, but instead I found myself whispering words I hadn't meant to say aloud. "If you come any closer, I won't be able to pretend anymore," I said, barely above a breath. He didn't answer, not out loud, just let his fingers slide along my jaw and leaned forward until his lips were on my neck, slow and careful, like he was waiting for me to change my mind. But I didn't. I let my hand curl into the back of his hair and my other slide up his arm, and the sound that left my throat wasn't a gasp or a cry, but something quieter, more dangerous. Relief. Then everything shifted. Not inside us, but around us. Because just as he pressed closer, and I didn't step back, didn't speak, only stood there with my hands at his shoulders and a silence between us that said too much. Laura? It was Eric, and he was home early. The sound of his voice hit harder than it should have. Not loud, not even angry, just surprised and close enough that the vibration of his steps on the hardwood floor made everything inside me snap back into reality, like someone yanked the power cord from the wall, and in the same instant I shoved Josh away with more force than I meant to, hands pressing into his chest as I scrambled to sit upright and rearrange my shirt like it could somehow undo what had already happened. My breath sharp in my throat and my legs too shaky to stand without grabbing the edge of the couch for balance. Josh didn't argue, didn't resist, didn't say anything, just moved back slowly, like someone who knew how quickly a fire could turn on you if you breathed the wrong way. I heard Eric's footsteps coming through the foyer, then the telltale sound of his keys dropping into the ceramic bowl on the table near the stairs, and every second felt like its own disaster, like the walls were collapsing one creak at a time, and I knew I had seconds, not minutes, to cover the wreckage of what we'd just let happen. I rushed into the kitchen, my movements clumsy and uncoordinated, yanking open drawers like I was searching for a spatula or something else to make it look like I was mid-dinner prep, hands trembling so badly I could barely keep hold of the cutting. Bored, I grabbed off the counter. The kitchen lights were too bright when he walked in, that familiar scent of hospital soap still clinging to his scrubs as he dropped his bag near the fridge, and I forced my mouth into a smile that didn't touch. My eyes, my voice pitched too high when I said, "I thought you weren't back until Saturday night. I didn't expect you so early." He gave me a tight nod, rubbing the back of his neck like he did when he was overtired or annoyed or both, and answered with that same polite distance that had crept into our marriage over the last 6 months. Shift got cut short. One of the other guys came back from leave early. I figured I'd surprise you. I laughed a little too hard, fumbled with the oven dial like I had a casserole going that needed perfect timing, and before I could say anything else, Josh stepped into the doorway behind us, towel slung over one shoulder, shirt still damp from the bathroom, hair dripping at his temples like he'd just come from a shower, and maybe he had, or maybe it was just another move in whatever game we were playing that had suddenly turned deadly quiet. "Hey, Eric," Josh said, casual and easy like nothing, was wrong, like he hadn't had his hands on my hips less than 5 minutes ago, like he hadn't whispered against my skin in a voice that still echoed somewhere behind my ribs. "Didn't think you'd be back this early." Eric turned to look at him, eyes narrowing slightly, not with immediate suspicion, but with that heavy slowness that meant he was calculating things, piecing together the layout of the house, and the angle of the light and how long it would take someone to dry off and walk downstairs. "No one did," he replied. Then crossed his arms and looked at me, and in that single second, I felt like he could see through me completely, like every word I'd ever left unsaid was sitting between us in plain sight. Josh stepped further, into the room, grabbed the edge of the counter like it grounded him, and when he caught Eric's gaze again, something passed between them that wasn't loud or visible, but unmistakable, the shift that happens when two people silently agree. They're not talking about the same thing anymore. Eric tilted his head slightly, voice still neutral. "What were you doing on the second floor?" The question came out light, too light, like a string held loosely between fingers just waiting to be pulled, and Josh didn't blink, didn't hesitate, just said with that same unshakable calm, "Checking the shower, I thought I heard it leaking earlier when I passed by. Just wanted to make sure nothing was dripping." I stopped breathing, eyes locked on a smudge on the fridge door, like if I stared at it hard enough, the moment might pass. But it didn't. It stretched and curled around the room like smoke, and Eric didn't look away from Josh. Didn't smile, just nodded slowly like he was tucking the answer into a file somewhere behind his eyes for later. He turned to me then, not harshly, just slowly, and said, "You okay?" Like it meant something else, and I forced another nod, too quick, too eager, the kind of gesture that looks more guilty than any confession. "I'm fine," I said, the words falling out too fast, too smooth, and I didn't dare glance at Josh again. Didn't dare let my face move an inch because the heat rising in my chest had nothing to do with summer or kitchens or cooking, and everything to do with the fact that in that exact moment I realized something inside Eric had shifted. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he was watching, and more than that, he was waiting. Then Eric turned to me, and his face didn't change, but his voice did. It dropped lower, heavier, more intimate in a way that had nothing to do with tenderness and everything to do with the kind of betrayal that doesn't scream but cuts sharp and quiet. and he asked, still staring straight into my eyes without flinching, "Did you sleep with him?" My mouth opened, but nothing came out for a second, because it wasn't the question that hurt. It was the fact that he had already answered it for himself, that he had been carrying it inside him longer than I realized, and when I finally managed to whisper, "No, not yet," the silence that followed swallowed everything else I might have said, because it wasn't the denial he was looking for, and it wasn't enough to undo what he had seen. His jaw tensed just slightly, and then his hand lashed out toward him, the laundry basket like he needed something to throw, and the fabric wasn't heavy enough to break anything, but the sudden crash of clean clothes hitting the floor, socks scattering, hangers clanging, startled me like glass shattering in a still room, and I stepped back without meaning to as Josh moved forward instinctively, positioning himself between us with both hands raised in that quiet, defensive way that only made it worse. Eric's voice was louder now, but not out of control, like someone who had already gone through the screaming part in private, and was now operating on the edge of something colder, and he said, not to Josh and not really to me, but to the air between us, "You're my family. You're supposed to be my family. And you stood here, in my house, under my roof, and kissed my wife like I didn't matter." Josh didn't respond at first, just stood there with his shoulders squared and his head slightly down like he knew there was no right answer, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. And then he said quietly, "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." Eric let out a single dry laugh, not amused, not even angry, just hollow. And then he turned to me again, eyes unreadable now, voice flat like he was reporting something instead of feeling it, and said, "And you didn't even notice when I caught you, did you?" I already knew. Then he turned and walked out. No final speech, no dramatic pause, no plea for understanding. Just the sound of the door opening and closing behind him with a force that shook the frame but didn't break it, and I stood frozen in the same spot with my back against the washing machine, my arms crossed over my chest not for modesty, but to hold myself together. And when Josh reached for me, hand tentative, eyes searching for something that could still be salvaged, I stepped back, not out of anger, but out of something deeper and harder to explain. "Now," I said, voice quiet and thin and stretched too far to be strong, "now you ruined it." I didn't mean for the words to come out that way, not with so much finality, not like a closing door, but the moment they left my mouth, I knew they were true. Knew they came from that deep and quiet place where disappointment lives long after. The heat of desire has cooled, where the consequences catch up to your breath before your thoughts can. And as I watched Josh lower his hand like it had never been raised at all, I felt the weight of everything settle across my shoulders like soaked fabric, heavy and suffocating and impossible to shake off. He didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't defend himself with explanations or memories or soft promises about how things were supposed to be different. He just stood there with his hands at his sides, eyes fixed on mine like he thought maybe silence could say what words couldn't reach. And I looked back at him without blinking, not because I was strong or sure or brave, but because if I looked away, I knew I would shatter. And I was so tired of breaking quietly behind closed doors that I refused to flinch anymore. The laundry room still smelled like detergent and summer heat, that clean artificial scent that clung to fabric and skin. And I realized in that moment how absurd it was that so much had collapsed in a space designed for routine and order and mundane tasks, how something as mechanical as folding shirts had become the backdrop for a scene that would echo through the rest of my life like the last line in a play I never agreed to perform. Josh finally moved, just a step, just enough to close the distance that now felt as wide as a fault line. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, hoarse like it hadn't been used properly in hours. And he said, "I didn't come here to ruin anything, Laura. I couldn't stay away." And I almost laughed, not out of cruelty, not even out of disbelief, but because it was so painfully predictable. The way men used longing as an excuse for damage, the way they dressed up want as love and crossed lines, because they thought desire was a reason instead of a warning. And I shook my head slowly, pressing the back of my hand against my mouth like that could hold in everything else I didn't trust myself to say. "You didn't ruin it alone," I whispered eventually, and I hated that the words trembled when they came out, hated that I was still trying to take equal responsibility when the truth was we both knew this only happened because I let it, because I didn't stop it, not early enough, not firmly enough, not when it still mattered. And somewhere inside me, I knew that Josh had felt that shift too, had recognized the exact moment when I stopped closing doors and started leaving them unlocked. He looked like he wanted to come closer again, like he thought maybe there was still something left between us to save. But I stepped around him before he could move, walked back into the hallway without touching the walls because I didn't want anything else to feel like it belonged to this memory. And when I passed through the living room, I saw that Eric's coffee cup was still on the table, half full, steam gone, the ring of it staining the wood like proof that this morning had once been ordinary. The door was still open slightly from where Eric had left in such a rush, not swinging, just ajar, like an open wound that hadn't decided whether to close or bleed. And I stood there for a second longer than I should have, wondering if I should run after him, if I should try to fix something that felt already broken beyond recognition, but my feet didn't move. And in that stillness, I realized the worst part wasn't the guilt or the shame or the betrayal. It was the fact that I didn't even know what I wanted to happen next. Behind me, Josh stood at the end of the hallway like a shadow that refused to retreat, and for the first time since he arrived days ago, he didn't say anything, didn't fill the silence with charm or tension or vulnerability. He just waited, and when I finally turned to face him, I saw that something in his posture had changed, like even he had finally realized that no matter how close we stood, we were no longer on the same side of the moment. I walked past him without another word, climbed the stairs with my hand trailing lightly on the banister for balance, each step feeling heavier than the last. And when I reached the top landing, I didn't go to the bedroom, didn't sit on the bed or reach for my phone or curl up in a ball like the version of me from a year ago might have. I just stood in the hallway, staring at the family photo on the wall, the one from that New Year's trip where we were all smiling because no one had told the truth yet. Downstairs, the floor creaked softly like Josh had shifted his weight again, maybe deciding whether to stay or go, and I closed my eyes against the sound, not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't carry both grief and confusion in the same breath anymore without something inside me snapping for good. It had been 2 weeks since the front door closed behind Eric for the last time, 2 weeks since the sharp click of the lock echoed through the hallway like punctuation at the end of a sentence I never thought he'd finish. And the silence that settled afterward wasn't peaceful or cleansing or full of possibility like people always say about starting over. It was dry and hollow and mean in a way that made the house feel colder than it should have felt in mid-July, and every corner of every room seemed to shrink inward, curling around itself like even the walls were too ashamed to hold me anymore. The kitchen looked the same bowls stacked in the drying rack, same chipped mug with the navy blue rim I always used for morning coffee, same stupid magnet on the fridge that said, "Home is where the heart is," like a punchline no one wanted to laugh at. But now everything echoed more than it used to. Every footstep louder, every drawer sounding deeper when it shut, and the mail started arriving with envelopes I didn't recognize and postmarks I didn't want to read, until one afternoon I found the letter from the lawyer, plain white, printed, name, typed address, no return contact beyond an office downtown, and when I sat down on the couch and opened it with trembling hands, the words hit me harder than I was ready for. Eric had filed for divorce. And not only was he claiming emotional distress and moral breach, he was requesting full ownership of the house based on premarital equity and contributory damage. And though I didn't understand every legal term, I understood the message beneath all of it. He wanted me out, not just gone, erased. Kelly, of course, had already made her choice. Not that I expected her to do anything different, not after what happened, not after I let a part of her life become something I touched with both hands and no excuses. And by the time I worked up the nerve to call her, the phone went straight to voicemail on the first ring, and when I checked again an hour later, her profile was gone, her number blocked me, her name vanished from group chats and shared calendars, and all that was left was a voice message, short and final and shaking with a kind of fury I hadn't expected from someone usually so composed. "You didn't just ruin your life," her voice said, crackling through the speaker like a match lit too close to the edge. "You took something. That was mine. He was mine, always mine, and you knew that, Laura, you always knew." After that, there was no point in trying to explain. Not that I had a real explanation anyway, just a string of moments and bad instincts and silent decisions that built up like frost on glass, until one morning everything cracked without warning. And the only thing more impossible than fixing it was pretending it hadn't happened in the first place. Josh disappeared the same week. No calls, no messages, no notes slipped under doors or cryptic emojis sent late at night. Not even a knock or a voicemail or a single gesture that could have said, "I'm sorry," or "Are you okay?" or even just goodbye. And after a few days of waiting for something that never came, I started calling around, reaching out to people he used to mention in passing, friends from school, old coworkers. The guy who sold him hiking gear at that store he always swore was overpriced but still loved. And eventually, someone told me he'd left town, gone to Arizona for work. Something with construction or real estate or development. No one was sure. He'd said he needed space. Needed to clear his head, needed a change of air. He didn't say my name, not once. One night after a dinner I didn't finish and a movie I couldn't follow, I found myself digging through the drawer where I kept loose receipts and old photo booth strips and things I should have thrown out years ago, and beneath a stack of expired coupons and tangled charger cords, I found the picture from his high school graduation. The one I took with him at the end of the ceremony when everyone else was hugging family and tossing caps, and I stood beside him. smiling too widely, hand resting lightly on his shoulder because it felt innocent back then, because no part of me could have known that moment, that pose, that closeness, was going to be the start of something I wouldn't know how to stop years later when it came back to me in a different shape. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to decide whether to tear it or keep it or burn it or bury it, but instead I slipped it into the back pocket of my wallet like maybe I needed to carry it a little longer, not for hope or sentiment, but because letting go of the first wrong moment felt harder than all the ones that followed. That evening I returned home to a house that no longer carried the echo of familiar footsteps or the quiet rustle of someone moving just out of view. And as the dusk settled across the rooms like a sheet pulled gently over something no one wanted to wake, I walked through the front hallway with that same habitual glance toward the doorframe where Eric used to toss his keys, even though I knew the space would stay empty, and when I noticed the folded page slipped beneath the door like it had been delivered in secret by someone too certain of their message to wait for a response. I bent down slowly, feeling the stiffness in my legs from sitting too long in that cafe, and opened the letter with a deliberate care I hadn't given anything in days. There was no envelope, no name, no sign of where it had come from except the unmistakable feel of Eric's logic stamped into the single line typed in the center of the page, as if anything more than one sentence would be redundant. And when I read the words, "You chose who you are. Don't complain when you have to be her," something inside me didn't crack or burn or break the way it might have 2 weeks ago, but instead settled deeper into a place I hadn't wanted to name, a place where silence replaced shock and understanding didn't come with comfort. And as I stood holding that page between my fingers like a piece of someone else's life I was still being forced to read, I realized it was never going to be about anger or forgiveness anymore, only endurance. Later that night, when the house had gone entirely still, and the air outside the windows turned thick with the kind of summer quiet that made every sound feel louder than it should, I found myself walking back into the garage not to fix or clean or organize, but to exist in a space where nothing demanded answers. And I sank down onto the cold cement floor beside the old plastic bin that still held the tools we never managed to sort, reaching in without looking until my fingers wrapped around the heavy wooden handle of the hammer that had once been just a tool and now felt like a beginning I hadn't realized I was reaching for. And I held it across my lap without tension, without purpose, only with the kind of numb acceptance that comes from finally understanding what object memory really means. The weight of it wasn't unfamiliar, and the grain of the wood still bore the same uneven ridges I'd gripped that day in the garage before I fell, before Josh caught me, before everything rewrote itself in a heartbeat I should have ignored. And as I sat there staring at the dust floating in the dim light that filtered through the single overhead bulb, I let the moment stretch until it filled every corner of my chest with the kind of quiet that didn't ask for answers, because the question had already been written across every day since. Did it all really start with this? With a fall? With a reflex? With a hand on my waist that lingered half a second too long? When I stood, the hammer still in my hand, but not clenched like a weapon, just resting like something I didn't want to drop, I walked back through the house in the dark without turning on the lights, past the table where unopened mail still waited, and the sink, where dishes for one now stacked neatly without ever being used twice in the same day, until I reached the hallway mirror at the base of the stairs, the same mirror I used to check my hair in before Eric and I went out. The same mirror where I once caught my own eyes and thought I still recognized the woman in the glass. But now the reflection was different, not older in a visible way, but marked in places only I could feel, worn in the small invisible corners, where love used to settle before it left without packing a bag. I sat down on the floor in front of that mirror with the hammer laid beside me on the wood like an offering, not because I needed it anymore, but because it belonged to the story now whether I liked it or not. And as I looked at myself without blinking, letting the silence curl around me like a shawl soaked in everything I hadn't said out loud, I whispered into the quiet with a voice that didn't shake and didn't rise, just floated across the room like a thread unraveling too slowly to stop. You know what's worse? And though the walls didn't answer, and no voice came back from upstairs or downstairs, or the past that stretched behind me like a hallway with no doors, I spoke again, softer now. Not for anyone else, but because the words still needed to exist, somewhere outside of my ribs. I really thought one of you would show up, but no one did, and maybe that was the point.